The Saharan sun, a vast and benevolent eye of molten gold, descends towards the horizon, casting long, attenuated shadows across the ochre dunes. A slow and rhythmic sound, almost like the desert's own heartbeat, precedes the arrival of the long camel train, their padded feet making soft thuds in the cooling sand. These are the merchants of the salt routes, completing their arduous journey as the fabled city of Timbuktu materializes from the evening haze. Its great mud, brick walls seeming to have grown from the very earth itself. Before them, the distinctive, buttressed minaret of the Djenne River. Mosque stands silhouetted against a sky of deepening indigo, and from its heights, the muezzin's call to prayer begins to drift over the city, a sound not of command, but of gentle invitation. The air carries a complex perfume of baked earth, tired animals, and the distant, promising aroma of wood smoke and spiced food wafting from the courtyards within the city's embrace. Here, at the crossroads of a continent, the wealth of an empire, built not only on glittering gold, but on these slabs of crystalline salt and the accumulated wisdom of its scholars, finds its sanctuary for the night. Good evening, and welcome back to Empires at Dusk. Tonight, we drift toward the heart of West Africa, seeking the faint echoes of the once mighty Mali Empire, a kingdom whose foundations were laid not on rock, but upon the endlessly shifting dunes of the Sahara. For a brief, brilliant period, this realm became the world's golden heart. Its fabulous wealth in precious metal and salt drawing long lines of laden camels from Cairo to the coasts. Their passage, whispered about in the distant markets of Europe. We will trace its story from the legendary rise of Sundiata Keita to the slow, inevitable reclamation of its great cities of learning and commerce by the patient, encroaching desert. In the vast expanse of West Africa, where the blistering sands of the Sahara relent into the thorny scrubland of the Sahel, there flows a river of improbable life, a great bend of water known as the Niger. This serpentine artery, coursing for thousands of miles from the highlands of Guinea towards the desert before turning southwards again, has for millennia been the region's lifeblood, its creator of kingdoms, and its measure of time. A traveler journeying along its banks in the 12th century would have witnessed a world of stark and beautiful contrasts, where the deep green of the flooded rice paddies stood against the endless ochre of the plains, and the cool, damp scent of the river mud mingled with the hot, dusty breath of the harmattan wind blowing from the north. Along this river, society was measured by the seasonal pulse of its waters, the annual inundation bringing with it a deposit of rich silt that made agriculture possible in an otherwise unforgiving landscape, creating a ribbon of civilization stitched into the fabric of the continent. Here, the rhythm of existence was dictated not by clocks or calendars, but by the slow drift of pirogues laden with salt and grain. the patient casting of fishing nets into the murky water, and the lowing of cattle coming to drink at the water's edge as the sun bled across the horizon. The air would have carried the distant, percussive sound of women pounding millet, a steady and communal heartbeat echoing from villages of round, mud, brick houses thatched with river grasses. This was a world held in a delicate balance, a mosaic of peoples and cultures. The Soninke, the Tuareg, the Fulani, and the Mandinka, all drawing their sustenance from the river and the fragile grasslands that it nourished. For centuries, this balance had been overseen by a formidable power that lay to the west, a wealthy and influential state whose name was whispered with respect in the markets of the Maghreb and beyond: the ancient Ghana Empire. Yet, by the beginning of the 13th century, the Great Ghana Empire, known to its own people as Ouagadougou, was little more than a memory, a ghost haunting the political landscape of the Western Sudan. Its long, slow decline, brought on by a combination of internal strife, persistent drought, and the disruptive incursions of the Almoravids from the north, had created a profound and dangerous power vacuum in the region. The old order, which had for so long controlled the immensely lucrative trans-Saharan trade routes. The silent, plodding camel caravans that carried precious gold from the south to exchange for slabs of salt from the desert mines, had finally crumbled. A merchant arriving at a city like Kombisele, once the bustling dual capital of Ghana, might have found its stone houses falling into disrepair and its marketplaces unnervingly quiet. The web of trust and tradition that had bound the region together, now frayed and torn. This fragmentation left the smaller kingdoms and chieftaincies of the Sahel vulnerable, their populations scattered and their resources diminished, creating an environment ripe for conquest by a new and more ruthless authority. Into this void stepped a formidable warrior, king named Sumanguru Kantier, the leader of a people known as the Soso, who had once been vassals of the Ghana Empire. Sumanguru was a man of the blacksmith caste, a group held in both awe and fear for their command of fire and iron, and he wielded this association with masterful effect. His ambition was not merely to rule, but to dominate, and he forged his nascent kingdom through a brutal campaign of expansion, his armies sweeping across the beleaguered lands of the old empire with a fearsome and seemingly unstoppable momentum. The reign of Sumanguru and his Soso kingdom was remembered by the Mandinka peoples as a time of profound darkness and oppression, an age of iron and sorrow. Oral traditions, passed down through generations of griots, paint him as a cruel tyrant and a powerful sorcerer, a man who decorated his chambers with the skulls of defeated kings, and who drew his strength from dark and ancient magic. While such accounts are steeped in the language of myth, they speak to the very real terror that his rule inspired, a suffocating presence that extinguished the embers of local autonomy and demanded absolute subjugation. The surviving accounts suggest that Sumangaru's dominion was absolute. He seized control of the goldfields, imposed heavy taxes, and dealt with any hint of dissent with swift and merciless violence, leaving a trail of razed villages and subjugated peoples in his wake. Among the many groups who fell under the shadow of the Soso were the various Mandinka clans, a collection of related peoples living in the small kingdoms scattered throughout the upper reaches of the Niger and Senegal rivers. For generations, they had lived as farmers and traders, their society organized around ancestral lineages and the authority of their local Mansas, or kings. Under Sumanguru, their world was turned upside down. Their leaders were killed or forced to pay humiliating tribute, and their people were subjected to the whims of a distant and fearsome overlord. A heavy silence would have fallen over the Mandinka heartland, the joyous sounds of village life replaced by a quiet watchfulness. A world where laughter was muted and hope was a dangerous commodity. It was into this climate of fear and subjugation that a child was born in the capital of the Mandinka kingdom of Kangaba, a boy whose destiny, it was whispered, was to forge a new and greater empire from the ashes of the old. This child was named Sundiata Keita, son of the Mandinka king, Nare Magan Konate, and his second wife, Sogolon Konde, a woman described in the epics as hunched and unattractive, but possessed of a powerful spirit. Sundiata's early years were not those of a prophesied hero, but were instead marked by profound hardship and humiliation. He was born with a physical affliction that left his legs weak and useless, unable to stand or walk, while other children of the court ran and played in the dusty palace grounds. One can almost feel the oppressive heat in the royal compound of Niani and see the young prince dragging himself through the dirt, enduring the scorn of his father's other wives and the pitying glances of the court elders. His mother, Sogolon, suffered alongside him, bearing the brunt of the mockery meant for her crippled son. Yet she protected him fiercely, instilling in him a quiet resilience that would prove more valuable than physical strength. The prophecies surrounding his birth, which foretold that he would one day become a great ruler, seemed like a cruel joke in the face of his condition, a bitter irony that only deepened the shame his family endured. As Sumanguru Kante consolidated his power and extended his reach, the threat to the Mandinka royal family grew ever more acute, culminating in a decision that would change the course of history. Fearing for their lives and seeking refuge from the escalating court intrigues and the encroaching power of the Soso king, Sundiata, his mother, and his sisters were forced into exile. This departure was not a grand procession, but the quiet flight of a disgraced family, slipping away from their home with little more than the clothes on their backs, their future an unknown and daunting road stretching out before them. Their long years of wandering took them across the vast tapestry of West Africa, a journey that became an unintended and profound education for the young prince. They found temporary refuge in the courts of various kingdoms, from the plains of the Jollof to the bustling state of Mecca. Each stop offering Sundiata a new perspective on the arts of statecraft, diplomacy, and war. A traveler might have seen him as just another face in a foreign court, a quiet and observant young man whose lame legs belied a growing strength of character. It was during this period of exile, far from the land of his birth, that Sundiata, through sheer force of will and a grueling regimen, finally overcame his physical infirmity, learning not only to walk, but to become a formidable hunter and a charismatic leader of men. The boy, who had been an object of pity, was slowly, painstakingly transforming into the man the prophecies had foretold. His spirit forged in the twin crucibles of childhood suffering and the harsh realities of exile. He learned the languages of other peoples, understood their customs, and began to build the alliances that would one day form the bedrock of his return. His mind absorbing the intricate political geography of a world that he was destined to reshape. The story of the Malian Empire's emergence does not begin with the clash of armies, but with a whisper of hope carried on the dry harmattan wind, a wind that scoured the ochre, dusted lands of the Mandan people. For years, this region had languished under the dominion of the Soso kingdom and its formidable ruler, Sumanguru Kante, a blacksmith king whose name was spoken with a mixture of fear and reluctant awe. The traditions speak of him as a sorcerer, a man who drew power from dark and ancient practices. But his earthly power was far more tangible, built upon tribute and the suppression of the old Mandinka aristocracy, whose authority he had systematically dismantled. In the villages scattered across the savannah, beneath the shade of sparse acacia trees, life continued with a muted rhythm. The laughter of children seeming a little less loud. The evening stories told by the griots carefully edited to avoid any mention of a time before the Soso's ascendancy. The air itself seemed heavy with a sense of waiting. The scent of wood smoke from the cooking fires mingling with the dust of a land holding its breath. Into this tense and watchful world, a figure returned from the quiet obscurity of exile. The young prince Sundiata Keita, once a disabled child mocked and underestimated, had grown into a man of quiet charisma and formidable will during his years away in the neighboring kingdom of Mecca. His return was not a grand procession with banners flying, but a more subtle and powerful gathering, like streams trickling together to form a river after a long drought. News traveled not through official decree, but through the ancient and trusted networks of family, clan, and trade. A runner carrying a message, a merchant with a coded word for a trusted peer, a drummer whose rhythms carried a specific, urgent meaning across the wooded hills. This was how the Confederation began to form. Clan chiefs of the Mandinka, long divided by petty rivalries, but now united by a common oppressor, met in secret groves and secluded clearings. The low murmur of their voices, a counterpoint to the chirping of insects in the deepening twilight. They saw in Sundiata not just the son of a former king, but the fulfillment of a prophecy, a prophesied leader who, it was said, would unite the 12 clans of the Mandan and forge a new and lasting peace. As Sundiata traveled from one chiefdom to the next, he gathered not just soldiers but loyalty, weaving together a coalition from the disparate threads of Mandinka society. He appealed to the hunters, masters of the bush and its secrets, whose tracking skills and knowledge of the terrain were invaluable. He earned the trust of the farmers, whose harvests would feed the growing army, and whose connection to the land was the spiritual bedrock of their communities. He honored the griots, the living libraries of their people, ensuring that the history and the laws that were being forged would be remembered and passed down through the generations. This was not merely a military alliance, but the reawakening of a nation, a careful reassembly of a fractured cultural identity. One might have observed these gatherings and felt not the tension of a war council, but the solemnity of a sacred pact being made. The air thick with the scent of cola, nuts being broken and shared as a symbol of unity and enduring fellowship. The forces that answered his call were a diverse tapestry archers, with their famously potent poisons, horsemen from the more open plains, and infantry who knew every path and secret waterway of the Niger's inland delta. The inevitable confrontation with Sumanguru Kante and the Sasso army finally came on a sun-scorched plain near a small village named Karina, a name that would echo through the epics of West Africa for centuries. The oral traditions, which form the primary record of this pivotal day around the year 1235, paint the battle as a titanic struggle between two forms of power. On one side stood Sumanguru, clad in human skin and surrounded by his fetish, adorned commanders, representing an older, more tyrannical form of magic and authority. On the other was Sundiata, who, according to the legends, possessed his own powerful sorcery, a spiritual strength drawn from the very land, and the collective will of his people. As dawn broke on the day of the battle, the rising sun would have illuminated a vast and stirring scene. Two armies arrayed across a plain of red earth, the air still and heavy with anticipation. The light would have caught the tips of countless spears and the polished surfaces of wooden shields, while the low, guttural sound of war horns echoed across the landscape, a mournful and yet defiant call to a destiny that was about to be decided. The ensuing Battle of Karina was, by all accounts, a long and desperate struggle. A churning maelstrom of dust and sound and flashing iron under the relentless glare of the African sun. It was not a battle of intricate tactics, so much as a contest of sheer will and spiritual endurance. The epics focus on the personal duel between the two leaders, a symbolic confrontation that decided the fate of their people. It is said that Sumangaru's magical protections initially rendered him immune to conventional weapons, but Sundiata, having learned the secret of his rival's vulnerability, fashioned a special arrow tipped with the spur of a white cock, the one thing that could nullify the Sasso king's power. Whether this detail is literal or allegorical, its meaning is clear. Sundiata's victory was one of intelligence and sacred knowledge over brute force and profane magic. With Sumangaru's defeat and flight from the field, the morale of the Sasso army shattered completely. A profound stillness would have eventually descended upon the plain of Karina, the silence broken only by the cries of carrion birds and the groans of the wounded, as the victorious Mandinka forces slowly began to comprehend the magnitude of what they had achieved. The age of Sasso dominance was over, and the path was now clear for the creation of something entirely new. In the wake of his decisive victory, Sundiata Keita was formally proclaimed Mansa, or King of Kings, the undisputed ruler of the newly united Mandan peoples. His first act as Mansa was not to embark on further conquests, but to lay the foundations for a stable and prosperous state, a task he approached with the same deliberate care he had used to build his coalition. He chose a site for his capital, a new city to be called Niani, strategically located in a fertile region on a tributary of the Niger River, well positioned to command the trade routes and benefit from the rich agricultural land. The early construction of Niani would have been a site of communal purpose. The sounds of axes felling timber and the rhythmic chants of workers mixing mud and straw for the walls of the new compounds. A visitor arriving during this period would have smelled the damp, earthy scent of new construction and witnessed a city rising not from stone and mortar in the style of other empires, but from the very soil of the land itself, its architecture a reflection of the environment and the communal ethos of its builders. Niani was conceived not as a fortress, but as a vibrant heart for a new imperial body. It was here, at a great assembly of the clans near Niani, that Sundiata presided over the proclamation of the Kurokan Foga, the oral constitution of the Mali Empire. This was a remarkable political and social achievement, a charter of rights and a system of governance recited into existence by the assembled griots and committed to the prodigious memory of the oral historians. It was not written on parchment or carved in stone, but woven into the very fabric of the society. It was meant to govern, making every citizen a guardian of its principles. The Kurokan Foga, as the surviving accounts suggest, organized the new federation with extraordinary foresight. It divided the Mandinka clans into castes based on their trade: warriors, artisans, marabouts, and griots, granting each a defined role and social standing. It established a federal structure with a grand assembly of clan elders to advise the Mansa, creating a system of checks and balances on royal power. Perhaps most remarkably, it contained provisions that we might now recognize as fundamental human rights, outlining rules against the mistreatment of prisoners, and even, it is said, granting a measure of respect and protection to women. The air at this great assembly would have been thick with the smoke of celebratory feasts and the powerful, resonant voices of the Bala Fasikie. Sundiata's personal griot, as the laws of the new Mali, were spoken into being for the first time. With the political and social structure of his empire established, Sundiata and his successors turned their attention to securing the economic pillars upon which Mali's future wealth would be built. The first and most crucial of these was control over the legendary goldfields of Bambouk and Bure, located to the south. These were not deep, shaft mines in the modern sense, but vast alluvial deposits where gold dust and nuggets could be painstakingly sifted from riverbeds and shallow pits. The work was secretive and shrouded in tradition, carried out by local communities who had worked the deposits for generations. Rather than seizing the mines by force, which might have disrupted the delicate social and spiritual practices surrounding the gold, the Mansas established a system of overlordship, protecting the mining communities and taxing the gold that was brought to market. A traveler venturing into these regions would have found a landscape of rolling hills and dry river channels, the silence broken only by the rhythmic splash of water in wooden pans and the quiet murmur of workers communicating in their local dialects. A subtle but constant flow of wealth beginning its long journey north. Just as gold was the key to Mali's southern frontier, salt was the indispensable treasure of the north. The empire extended its influence deep into the Sahara to control the vital salt mines at Tagaza, a desolate and unforgiving place where the landscape was a blinding expanse of crystallized salt under a shimmering sky. Here, enslaved laborers quarried massive slabs of pure salt, a commodity so valuable in the humid climate of the south, where it was essential for preserving food and life itself, that it was often traded for its weight in gold. Caravans of thousands of camels, their soft footfalls the only sound for miles, would transport these salt slabs southwards, their journey tracing the arteries of the trans-Saharan trade network that Mali now commanded. The feel of the air at Tagaza would have been intensely dry, the sun's heat reflecting off the white ground with a ferocious intensity, a stark contrast to the lush humidity of the Niger's banks. Yet both were now integral parts of the same imperial economy. Finally, the empire consolidated its control over the fertile lands, irrigated by the great Niger River itself, the lifeblood of the entire region. The river was a highway, a source of food, and the core of the empire's agricultural heartland. Along its banks, farmers cultivated rice, millet, and sorghum, producing surpluses that could feed the empire's growing cities and armies. Fishermen from the Bozo clan, masters of the river, plied its waters in long, elegant pirogues, their nets bringing in a bounty of fish that were dried and smoked for trade. The control of key river ports like Djenne and later Jau and Timbuktu ensured that all commerce that flowed along this vital artery would now enrich the coffers of the Mansa. To stand on the banks of the Niger at dusk during this era would be to witness the empire's circulatory system in motion, the slow, deliberate movement of barges laden with grain, the distant songs of boatmen echoing over the water, and the scent of cooking fires from the villages lining the shore. Through the shrewd consolidation of these three sources of wealth, the gold of the south, the salt of the north, and the agricultural bounty of the river, the foundations laid by Sundiata Keita at Karina were transformed into an enduring economic powerhouse, setting the stage for the golden age that was to follow. It was in the early decades of the 14th century that the Mali Empire, which had been a formidable regional power, began to shimmer in the consciousness of the wider world, coalescing from a distant rumor into a tangible legend of almost unbelievable wealth. This transformation was embodied by one man, its most celebrated ruler, Mansa Musa, whose reign represents the zenith of Malian prestige, a period when the kingdom's heart, heavy with gold, beat so strongly that its pulse was felt from the Mediterranean to the Arabian Peninsula. The story of his great pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 is not merely an anecdote of royal piety, but the pivotal event that etched the name of Mali onto the maps and into the minds of medieval cartographers and kings. A grand and extravagant piece of political theater, played out across thousands of miles of desert. The surviving accounts suggest a procession of such staggering scale that it must have resembled a mobile city inching its way across the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the Sahara. A traveler fortunate enough to witness its departure from the capital of Niani would have seen a column of humanity stretching to the horizon, a river of people and animals flowing north towards the great sea of sand. At its head rode the Mansa himself, surrounded by his personal guard, their armor glinting in the fierce sun. But behind him followed a retinue that defied easy comprehension. The numbers passed down by chroniclers are likely exaggerated by the awe of those who saw it. Yet they speak to a profound truth about the empire's resources. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians, officials, entertainers, merchants, and a vast contingent of enslaved people who carried the burdens of the journey. Their presence a somber testament to the era's social realities. The most memorable feature of this caravan, however, was the gold, a seemingly inexhaustible river of it. Camels, perhaps 100 of them, were said to be laden with sacks of pure gold dust, each beast carrying a significant fortune, while attendants walked alongside, ready to distribute this wealth with a generosity that would become legendary. The air would have been thick with the scent of dust, animal musk, and the faint, sweet smell of perfumes worn by the courtly elite, a strange and intoxicating mixture moving through the starkly beautiful landscape of the Sahel. When this glittering procession finally arrived in Cairo, after months of arduous travel, it caused an economic disruption that was spoken about for generations. Mansa Musa, adhering to the principles of alms giving, dispensed gold with such a lavish hand that the very foundations of the Cairene economy were shaken. He gave gifts to the Sultan of Egypt, endowed charities, and flooded the markets with so much raw bullion that the price of the dinar plummeted, its value not recovering for more than a decade. It was an unintentional, yet profoundly effective, demonstration of power. Here was a ruler from the heart of sub-Saharan Africa, a land many in the Mediterranean world considered a primitive backwater, who could, with a casual act of generosity, destabilize the economy of one of the world's great cities. The impression he left was indelible, and when European mapmakers, like Abraham Cresques in his famous Catalan Atlas of 1375, came to draw the continent of Africa, they placed in its western heart the figure of a dark-skinned king, crowned and enthroned, holding aloft a glistening orb of solid gold, a potent symbol of this distant, impossibly rich kingdom. Mansa Musa had not simply gone on a pilgrimage, he had announced Mali's arrival on the world stage, forever altering the perception of his empire from a remote territory into a land of golden dreams. Upon his return, laden with new ideas and accompanied by scholars and artisans from the wider Islamic world, Mansa Musa began to invest his kingdom's immense wealth back into its own soil, transforming the temporary architecture of the Sahel into something monumental and enduring. He is credited with bringing back an Andalusian poet and architect named Abu Ishaq as Sahili, who introduced new construction techniques that would define the region's aesthetic for centuries to come. This gave rise to the magnificent Sudaino, Sahelian style, an architecture born of the very earth it stands upon, where great mosques and palaces seem to grow organically from the ochre-colored landscape. In the key cities of the empire, particularly Djenne and Timbuktu, this new architectural vision flourished, creating structures that were both deeply spiritual and profoundly connected to their environment. A visitor approaching the great mosque of Djenne would have been struck by its sheer, imposing scale, the largest mud-built structure in the world. Its 3 great minarets, rising like earthen spires towards a pale blue sky. The material itself, a mixture of sun, dried mud, rice husks, and shea butter known as banko, gives the walls a soft, almost living texture. Cool to the touch even under the blistering afternoon sun. The surfaces are not smooth, but are studded with projecting wooden beams, known as ars touran, which serve both a structural and aesthetic purpose, casting a constantly shifting pattern of linear shadows across the undulating walls. Stepping from the bright, dusty street into the mosque's interior would have been to enter another world. A vast and tranquil forest of thick, earthen pillars. The air inside is cool and still, smelling faintly of dust and baked earth. The outside world's noise muffled to a low, distant hum. Light filters down from small openings high in the ceiling, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the narrow shafts of sun, creating a sense of quiet, contemplative reverence. This was not a static monument, but a building that required the constant care of its community. Its outer layer of mud plaster washed away by the brief, intense rains each year, only to be renewed in a great communal festival, a testament to the collective faith that had raised it from the ground. In Timbuktu, this architectural flowering was inextricably linked to the city's burgeoning intellectual life, with the Sankor Mosque becoming the heart of a great university. Like its counterpart in Djenne, it was a masterpiece of earthen construction, its pyramidal minaret a distinctive landmark against the desert horizon. But its true significance lay within its courtyards and libraries. Here, the wealth of Mali was transmuted from gold into knowledge. The university was not a single, monolithic institution in the European sense, but rather a loose affiliation of independent schools, each led by a master scholar. Students would gather in the cool, shaded courtyard of a teacher's house or in the quiet arcades of the mosque, sitting on woven mats as they absorbed lessons in Islamic law, theology, astronomy, and rhetoric. A quiet and scholarly atmosphere would have pervaded these spaces, the loudest sounds being the low murmur of recitation and the dry rustle of turning pages. The education was rigorous and personal, with students progressing at their own pace until they had mastered a particular text or discipline, eventually becoming masters themselves and adding to the city's intellectual capital. Timbuktu became a beacon for scholars across the Islamic world, and its reputation as a city where books were prized above all other commodities grew. It was said that the trade in manuscripts was the most profitable in the city, with rare and beautifully illuminated texts fetching prices far exceeding their weight in gold. The libraries of Timbuktu, both public and private, swelled with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, some copied locally by skilled scribes, others carried at great expense across the Sahara. These were not just religious texts, but a vast repository of human knowledge covering mathematics, medicine, philosophy, geography, and poetry. To hold one of these volumes would be to feel the smooth, worn leather of its binding, and to see the elegant, flowing lines of Maghrebi script, the ink still dark and clear after centuries. The city's golden age was therefore not just one of material wealth, but of profound intellectual curiosity. A place where the light of inquiry burned as brightly as the desert sun, creating an oasis of learning in the midst of the shifting sands. The very air of Timbuktu seemed saturated with a reverence for the written word, a quiet understanding that the empire's greatest treasure was not the gold buried in the earth, but the wisdom collected in its libraries. Away from the rarefied air of the royal court and the scholarly halls of Timbuktu, the vast majority of the empire's subjects lived their lives in harmony with the rhythms of the land and the great river that sustained it. The Niger River was the central artery of Mali, a source of life, and a highway for commerce, its annual flood dictating the cycles of planting and harvest. A traveler drifting down the river at dawn would have witnessed a timeless scene. The mist rising slowly from the dark, placid water, obscuring the low banks lined with acacia and baobab trees. Through the haze, the silent, elegant shapes of fishermen in long, narrow boats called pirogues would appear. Others called their bodies silhouetted against the rising sun as they cast their circular nets with a graceful, practiced motion, the water shattering into 1,000 silver droplets. The air would carry the smell of the damp earth and the distant scent of wood smoke from the small villages nestled along the river's edge. A gentle awakening to the day's labors. In the fertile lands of the inland delta, where the river's floodwaters receded to leave behind a layer of rich, dark silt, farmers tended to their crops. The primary staple was rice, cultivated in carefully managed paddies, but millet, sorghum, and fonio were also grown, their tall stalks swaying in the gentle breeze. The work was communal and followed ancient patterns, with entire families participating in the planting and the harvest, their songs often carrying across the fields as they worked under the hot West African sun. Life was not easy and was subject to the caprices of rainfall and flood, but it possessed a deep and abiding connection to the natural world, a cycle of seasons that had been repeated for countless generations. Further from the river, herders guided their cattle across the sparse grasslands of the Sahel, their lives a slow and patient migration in search of pasture, their wealth measured not in gold, but in the health and number of their animals. These threads of daily life all converged in the empire's bustling markets, vibrant and chaotic centers of commerce and social interaction. In the marketplaces of cities like Djenne or Jiao, the air itself was a complex tapestry of smells: the sharp, salty tang of dried fish from the river. The earthy aroma of grains and yams piled high in woven baskets. The sweet, pungent scent of spices like ginger and black pepper. And the slightly bitter, stimulating fragrance of kola nuts, a vital commodity chewed for its caffeine. The visual spectacle would have been just as rich, with merchants displaying brightly colored textiles. The deep indigo and brilliant yellow dyes a stark contrast to the monochrome tones of the surrounding landscape. One might have heard the constant, low hum of a dozen different languages being spoken, as traders from across the desert and the savannah haggled over prices, their voices blending with the bleating of goats and the clanging of a blacksmith's hammer from a nearby workshop. These markets were the empire's social heart, places where news was exchanged, marriages were arranged, and the diverse peoples of Mali came together, their interactions weaving the strong, intricate fabric of the kingdom's daily existence. This complex society was held together by a well-defined and hierarchical social structure, with the Mansa at its absolute apex. The emperor was not merely a political leader, but a semi-divine figure, whose person was surrounded by elaborate ceremony and protocol designed to emphasize his immense power and separation from ordinary mortals. To be granted an audience with the Mansa was a rare and intimidating honor. Visitors were expected to approach the throne room with extreme humility, removing their footwear and prostrating themselves on the ground, before sprinkling their heads and backs with dust, a symbolic gesture acknowledging that they were but earth before their magnificent sovereign. The Mansa would sit enthroned, often on a platform draped in silk, speaking through an intermediary, his voice rarely heard directly by his subjects. He was surrounded by his courtiers, generals, and trusted advisors, a glittering assembly that reflected the wealth and power of the state he commanded. This courtly etiquette reinforced the immense gulf between the ruler and the ruled, cementing the Mansa's authority as absolute and divinely sanctioned. Below the royal family and the nobility was a society organized into clans and specialized castes, a system that provided social stability by assigning each individual a role from birth. Among the most important of these castes were the artisans, whose skills were essential to the functioning of the empire. The blacksmiths, known as Esh-Numu, were particularly revered and feared in equal measure, for they were masters of fire and iron, a transformation that seemed almost magical. They forged not only the tools for farmers and the weapons for soldiers, but were also believed to possess spiritual power, the ability to mediate disputes and heal sickness. Other groups, such as leatherworkers, potters, and weavers, also held hereditary roles, passing their specific knowledge and techniques down through generations, ensuring a high standard of craftsmanship and a continuity of tradition. Perhaps the most unique and vital of all these specialized groups were the Evgili, or griots, the keepers of the nation's memory. The griot was a historian, a storyteller, a praise singer, and a royal counselor. A living library of genealogy and oral tradition in a society where history was not primarily written, but spoken and sung. A griot at court would know the lineage of the Mansa, stretching back to the empire's founding, and could recite the epic of Sundiata Keita, other story of the nation's birth, for hours on end, his voice rising and falling with the drama of the tale. Their instrument, the kora, a 21-stringed lute bridge, would provide a shimmering, intricate accompaniment, its notes like falling water weaving a sonic tapestry around the words. They were more than mere entertainers. They were the social glue of the empire, their songs reminding everyone of their place in the grand narrative of Mali, connecting the present to the past and reinforcing the values and allegiances that held the kingdom together. The spiritual landscape of the Malian Empire during its golden age was as layered and complex as its social structure, a rich blend of Orthodox Islam and deeply rooted pre-existing traditional beliefs. Islam had arrived in West Africa centuries earlier, carried south along the trade routes by Berber and Arab merchants, and it was firmly established as the religion of the court and the urban elite. The Mansas, particularly from Musa onwards, were devout Muslims who saw the faith as a mark of sophistication and a tool for forging diplomatic and commercial ties with the wider Islamic world. The call to prayer, echoing from the mud-brick minarets of Timbuktu and Djenne 5 times a day, became part of the fundamental rhythm of city life. The great mosques were centers of state ceremony, and the study of the Quran and Islamic law formed the basis of the educational system, lending a veneer of Islamic piety and scholarship to the entire imperial project. Yet, this adherence to Islam did not erase the ancient spiritual beliefs that had governed life in the region for millennia. For the vast majority of the population, particularly in the rural villages, the world was still populated by a host of powerful spirits inhabiting the rivers, the trees, and the earth itself. These forces, it was believed, could influence the harvest, bring rain, or cause sickness, and they required respect and appeasement through specific rituals and offerings. The authority of village elders often rested on their perceived ability to communicate with these spirits and with the ancestors, who were thought to remain a guiding presence in the lives of their descendants. A farmer might pray towards Mecca at the appointed time, but he would also leave a small offering at the base of a sacred baobab tree before planting his crops. Small amulets containing verses from the Quran were commonly worn for protection, but they were often worn alongside older charms, intended to ward off specific local spirits or the evil eye. This syncretism was not seen as a contradiction by most, but as a pragmatic and holistic approach to the spiritual world, a way of accessing all available sources of power and protection. The Mansa himself had to skillfully navigate this dual spiritual identity. As a Muslim ruler, he built mosques and patronized Islamic scholars. But as the heir to a traditional kingship, his authority was also rooted in pre-Islamic beliefs about the sacred nature of his lineage. He was both the commander of the faithful and the guardian of the ancestral spirits of the land. This delicate balance, this weaving together of the global faith of Islam with the local traditions of the West African savanna, created a unique cultural synthesis that was one of the defining characteristics of the Malian Golden Age, a testament to the empire's ability to absorb and adapt foreign influences without losing its own distinctive soul. The magnificent superstructure of the Malian Empire, with its powerful court, its centers of learning, and its monumental architecture, was all built upon a foundation of commerce, specifically the control of the vast trans-Saharan trade routes. The empire was perfectly positioned to act as the middleman between the goldfields of West Africa to the south and the salt mines deep within the Sahara to the north, a role that gave it a near monopoly on the two most valuable commodities of the age. Caravans, the great ships of the desert, were the lifeblood of this trade, and their departure from a city like Gao or Timbuktu was a major undertaking. One could witness hundreds, sometimes thousands, of camels being loaded with goods, their guttural complaints filling the air as their handlers cinched down the leather harnesses. The preparations could take weeks, a slow accumulation of goods and personnel, before the caravan master finally gave the signal to begin the long, perilous journey northwards into the immense silence of the desert. The journey was a feat of endurance and navigational skill, with the caravans traveling between scattered oases, their routes guided by the stars at night and by the subtle contours of the ever-shifting dunes. The air on the open desert would be utterly still and clear, the sun a white, hot disk overhead during the day, and the night sky a breathtaking canopy of brilliant, unfamiliar stars. The primary goods moving north were gold, which was mined in the forests far to the south, beyond Mali's direct control, but traded through its markets, as well as ivory, ostrich feathers, and kola nuts. The most somber part of this trade, however, was the movement of enslaved people, captured in conflicts or raids on the empire's periphery, who were marched across the desert to be sold in the markets of North Africa and the Middle East. It was a brutal but accepted part of the economic system that generated so much of the empire's wealth. In return, the caravans brought back goods that were scarce or unobtainable in sub-Saharan Africa. The most vital of these was salt, cut into large, heavy slabs from mines at Tagaza and other desert locations, a commodity so precious that it was said to be traded for its weight in gold. But the caravans also brought back fine textiles from Europe and the Levant, glassware from Venice, perfumes from Arabia, manufactured goods like swords and tools, and, crucially, horses, which were essential for the Malian cavalry, but struggled to survive in the tropical climate. This constant, cyclical flow of goods, ideas, and people across the Sahara was the engine that powered the Golden Age. It filled the Mansa's treasuries, funded his armies, paid for the importation of books and scholars, and connected the heart of West Africa to the great civilizations of the Mediterranean and beyond, ensuring that for a brief, brilliant period, the pulse of the world economy was felt most strongly along the banks of the river Niger. Rest well. We will meet again at dusk. Even the most resplendent tapestry, woven with threads of gold and dyed with the deepest indigo, will eventually show the strain of its own weight. And so it was with the vast and celebrated empire of Malay. The Golden Age, presided over with such wisdom by Mansa Musa and later his brother, the diligent Mansa Suleiman, could not last forever. For the strength of the empire was ultimately the strength of the Mansa himself. Following Suleiman's death around the year 1360, the intricate weave of power, held together by a single, steady hand, began to loosen, and the first faint cracks appeared not on the distant frontiers, but within the perfumed, sun-drenched courtyards of the capital, Niani. The throne, once a symbol of unshakable authority, became the object of bitter and often bloody contention, a prize to be seized, rather than an office to be earned through merit and tradition. The historical accounts, though sometimes clouded by the biases of their authors, speak of a succession of rulers who lacked the formidable character of their predecessors. Musa's own son, Magan I, was said to have squandered much of the treasury, his reign a brief and profligate affair that seemed to treat the state's coffers as a personal inheritance. A traveler to Niani during these years might have noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere of the royal court, a new tension underlying the elaborate etiquette, the scent of expensive incense failing to mask the acrid smell of ambition and conspiracy. Where, once there, had been the confident deliberations of a secure dynasty, there were now whispers in shadowed alcoves and shifting allegiances that changed with the rising of the moon, creating a climate of uncertainty that rippled outwards from the palace like a tremor through the earth. This instability, at the very heart of the empire, was a profound weakness, a signal to both internal vassals and external rivals that the great lion of the Mandan Kurufaba was perhaps not as fearsome as it once had been. This new fragility at the center was felt most keenly at the empire's periphery, where loyalty had always been a matter of pragmatic calculation as much as sworn fealty. For generations, the great trading cities, along the fertile crescent of the Niger River had paid tribute to the Mansa, their fortunes inextricably linked to the peace and security that Malian power guaranteed. Yet, as the throne in Niamey became a revolving door of short-lived and often ineffective rulers, the leaders of these powerful vassal states began to look to their own strength. Nowhere was this growing assertiveness more apparent than in the city of Gao, which sat strategically at the great eastern bend of the Niger, a vital hub for the salt, gold, and grain that moved along this liquid highway. The city hummed with its own distinct energy, a place where the Songhai people had long nurtured their own history and identity, and the calls of the boatmen poling their pirogues through the reeds held a different cadence to the courtly formalities of the capital. The rulers of Gao, who bore the title of Sunni, had long been vassals of Mali, but they were also the inheritors of an older kingdom, and they never entirely forgot it. They watched the succession crisis in Niamey with keen interest, sensing that the hand holding their leash was losing its grip. The surviving chronicles suggest that they began to quietly withhold portions of their tax revenues, testing the empire's resolve and finding it wanting. One can almost picture the scene: a Malian tax collector arriving in Jiao, his authority once unquestioned, now being met with polite excuses and delays. The deference of the local governor, masking a new, steely defiance. The city, which had been a jewel in the Malian crown, was slowly becoming the nucleus of the ascendant Songhai Empire, its markets and wharves buzzing with a confidence that was no longer borrowed from Mali, but was being forged anew in the kilns of its own ambition. This was not yet open rebellion, but a gradual, inexorable pulling away, like a great river slowly carving a new course for itself. As the internal bonds of the empire weakened, the formidable shield that had once protected its vast territories began to lower, inviting threats from beyond its borders. The Sahara, the great golden ocean that had brought Mali its wealth, now began to deliver its dangers with renewed frequency. From the north, the Tuareg, nomadic masters of the deep desert, saw an opportunity in the growing disarray. These were proud and resilient people who had long controlled sections of the trans-Saharan routes and viewed the wealthy, settled cities to their south with predatory eyes. For years, Malian garrisons had kept them in check. But with the central government distracted by internal squabbles, these garrisons were weakened or withdrawn. The consequences were felt most devastatingly in the year 1433, when Tuareg raiders swept down from the desert and seized Timbuktu, the intellectual and spiritual heart of the empire. The fall of the city was not a wholesale destruction, but a profound psychological blow. One imagines the quiet dread that fell over the Sankor Madrasa, the scholars gathering the precious manuscripts, their hands trembling as they hid away centuries of knowledge. The scent of old paper and leather mingling with the cold smell of fear. The bustling markets fell silent. The labyrinthine streets, once filled with the murmur of a dozen languages, were now hushed and watchful. At the same time, a second front of insecurity was opening to the south, where the powerful Mossi kingdoms launched increasingly bold raids into Malian territory, disrupting the agricultural heartlands that fed the cities. The feeling must have been one of being caught in a closing vise. The steady stream of caravans, the very lifeblood of the empire, now found their paths beset by danger, and the once unshakable sense of security that had been the bedrock of Mali's golden age began to crumble into dust. The disruptions caused by these raids and the growing power of Gao had a direct and debilitating effect on the empire's economy, which was the ultimate source of its power. The trans-Saharan trade was a delicate ecosystem, reliant on a network of trust, secure oases, and predictable political control. And when these elements faltered, the caravans, like water, simply sought an easier path. Merchants, whose families had for generations plied the routes through Walata and Timbuktu, began to hear troubling stories of raids and exorbitant new tolls levied by local chiefs, no longer afraid of the Mansa's wrath. A caravan master, weighing the risks, as he loaded his camels with salt slabs shimmering like crystal in the Tagaza sun, would have had to make a difficult choice: to continue on the traditional path through the increasingly unstable Malian heartland, or to divert his precious cargo eastward, towards the burgeoning Hausa city, states like Kano and Katsina, where the routes were perceived to be safer. This shift was not a sudden event, but a slow, creeping diversion of wealth, a process that unfolded over decades. The dust on the great western roads was stirred by fewer and fewer camel trains. The wells at remote oases were drawn from less frequently. The customs houses in Malian towns saw a dwindling stream of goods. The immense quantities of gold that had once flowed northwards from the mines of Bambuk and Bur, making the Mansa of Mali a figure of legend in Europe and the Middle East, now began to find alternative outlets. The empire's wealth had been built on its unique position as the middleman, the gatekeeper, between the gold fields of West Africa and the markets of the Mediterranean world. As that gate began to rust on its hinges and other doors opened to the east, the golden torrent that had sustained the empire slowed to a trickle, leaving the vast state apparatus with less revenue to pay its soldiers, maintain its mosques, and project its power. While these internal and regional pressures were slowly eroding Mali's foundations, a far more fundamental challenge was beginning to take shape, unseen and unheard. Hundreds of leagues to the south, west, on the shimmering waters of the Atlantic. In the mid-15th century, Portuguese caravels, marvels of new maritime technology, began to cautiously navigate their way down the unfamiliar west African coast. Driven by a desire for gold, spices, and a sea route to India, these voyages represented a momentous change in the geography of global trade. For millennia, the Sahara had been the primary interface between sub-Saharan Africa and the wider world, a formidable but ultimately crossable barrier. The Portuguese, however, were proposing to bypass it entirely. Their arrival on the coast, with ships that could carry more cargo than 1,000 camels, heralded the dawn of a new Atlantic age. A fisherman mending his nets in a coastal village might have been the first to see the strange ships, their white sails stark against the blue horizon, a sight as alien and ominous as a storm cloud on a clear day. At first, the Portuguese presence was small, a handful of trading posts and forts, like Elmina, established on the Gold Coast in 1482. They traded European cloth, metalware, and firearms for the very same gold that had once traveled north across the desert to Mali. This new coastal trade created a powerful gravitational pull, drawing the economic life of the region away from the interior and towards the sea. The rulers of Mali, whose power was rooted in their control of the desert routes, could only watch as the world's commercial map was redrawn, leaving their empire increasingly isolated and irrelevant. The cracks that had appeared in the court, on the frontiers, and along the trade routes were now joined by a vast oceanic fissure that was slowly sundering west, Africa's past, from its future, leaving the great Sahelian Empire on the wrong side of the divide. The sun was beginning to set on the age of the caravan, and with it, the long, slow twilight of Mali had truly begun. Rest well. We will meet again at dusk. The most resplendent sunset must eventually yield to the encroaching twilight. And so it was for the great Malian Empire, whose golden light had for so long illuminated the world. The slow, inexorable turning of the ages began to manifest not as a sudden storm, but as a persistent easterly wind, gathering strength along the great bend of the Niger River, where the city of Gao had long been a vassal, a jewel in the imperial crown, but a jewel with its own ambitions. Here, a new power was stirring, a force that drew its energy from the river itself, a martial dynasty that would come to be known as the Songhai. The cracks that had appeared within the vast Malian administration, the slow drift of succession disputes, and the loosening of central authority, now became gaping fissures through which this new ambition could flow. The architect of this new reality was a man of formidable will and military acumen, known to history as Sunni Ali, who ascended to the Songhai throne around 1464. He was a figure seemingly forged from the very landscape he sought to conquer, a pragmatist who blended traditional animist beliefs with a nominal Islam, using whichever served the moment's purpose, his gaze fixed not on Mecca's spiritual wealth, but on the tangible riches of the cities that had once paid fealty to the Mansa of Mali. Sunni Ali's campaigns were marked by a relentless and pragmatic speed. His army a combination of a powerful riverine navy and swift, disciplined cavalry that seemed to move with the speed of the desert wind. His first great prize was the city that had become the very soul of Mali's intellectual and spiritual life, Timbuktu. The accounts suggest that in 1468, his forces swept into the city, an event that sent a tremor of shock throughout the Islamic world. The once secure libraries and the tranquil courtyards of the Sankor Madrasa, which had for centuries smelled of old parchment and the faint, sweet scent of ink, were now filled with the metallic clang of armor and the unfamiliar authority of Songhai soldiers. The Tuareg chieftains who had been governing the city were expelled, and the scholars who had long enjoyed the patronage of the Malian court found themselves under a new, less predictable master, one who valued strategic control far more than he valued theological debate. 5 years later, in 1473, the other great trading hub of the region, the famously resilient city of Djenne, also fell to Sunni Ali's forces after a siege that the storytellers claim lasted for 7 years, 7 months, and 7 days. The capture of Djenne, with its intricate mud, brick architecture, and its bustling markets, was the final confirmation that the economic heart of the Sahel had been torn from Mali's grasp. The trans-Saharan trade routes, the arteries that had pumped gold and salt and knowledge into Mali, now flowed towards a new center of gravity in Jau, leaving the old empire to slowly atrophy. For the court of the Mansa, this was a period of profound and painful contraction, a retreat from the world stage into the cradle of their own origins. The empire, which had once stretched from the Atlantic coast deep into the Sahara, now shrank back to its Mandinka heartland, a smaller, more intimate kingdom centered on the old capital of Niani. One can imagine the atmosphere within the royal compound, the grand halls and audience chambers that had once welcomed emissaries from Cairo and Granada, now feeling umptuously vast. The vibrant hum of a dozen languages spoken by traders in the city's market would have been replaced by a more uniform murmur. The concerns of the court turning inward from imperial strategy to regional defense. The Mansa was still a king, still revered as the descendant of the great Sundiata Keita. But he was a king presiding over an age of memory rather than an age of expansion. The immense wealth that had so astonished the world during Mansa Musa's pilgrimage was now a legend. The gold fields themselves either exhausted or lying in territories no longer under Malian control. The empire became a shadow of its former self, a powerful regional state, certainly, but one whose horizons had been dramatically and permanently lowered, like a proud old lion returning to a smaller, more familiar territory after being driven from the wider plains. The savanna grasses grew taller around the edges of the capital, and the air once thick with the scent of 1,000 cooking fires from 1,000 caravans, now carried the simpler, cleaner smell of the surrounding bush. This diminished but stable state of affairs might have persisted for some time, a quiet epilogue to a grand story. Had the political landscape of the entire Sahel not been violently and irrevocably shattered by an event from far across the desert. In the late 16th century, the Sultan of Morocco, Ahmad al-Mansur, driven by a desire for the legendary Saharan gold and a need to control the salt mines of Tagaza, turned his ambitious gaze southward. He assembled a small but formidable army, its power resting not on numbers or cavalry, but on a new and terrifying technology, previously unseen in Saharan warfare, the arquebus, a primitive but effective firearm. In 1591, this Moroccan force, led by a Spanish eunuch named Judar Pasha, crossed the vast expanse of the Sahara and met the mighty army of the Songhai Empire at a place called Tondibi. The Songhai, under Askia Ishak II, fielded a massive, traditional force of horsemen and foot soldiers, their confidence high. But their spears and swords were no match for the disciplined volleys of musket fire. The sound of the arquebuses, a sharp, deafening crack that echoed across the dry plains, was the sound of a new era dawning, an era in which the old ways of war were rendered obsolete. The Songhai army, the very force that had humbled Mali, was utterly broken, scattering into the wind like dust. The Moroccan victory at Tondibi, however, did not lead to a new, stable empire. Instead, it created a vacuum of power that plunged the entire Niger Bend region into decades of chaos. The Moroccans were able to capture Jau, Timbuktu, and Djenne, but they lacked the numbers and the local knowledge to govern the vast territories of the former. Songhai Empire effectively. Their control frayed the further they moved from the river, and the region disintegrated into a patchwork of competing city, states, warlord territories, and roaming bands of conquerors. For the remnant of the Mali kingdom, this chaos to the east was both a reprieve and a curse. The Songhai, their great rival, had been annihilated, but the stability they had, however grudgingly, imposed on the region was gone as well. The trade routes became even more dangerous, subject to raids and arbitrary tolls, further isolating the Malian heartland. The delicate web of commerce and diplomacy that had sustained life in the Sahel for centuries was torn apart, leaving each small state to fend for itself in a world that had suddenly become much more dangerous and unpredictable. The remaining Manzas of Mali found themselves ruling a kingdom adrift, an island of tradition in a sea of anarchy, their historical authority meaning less and less in a land now governed by the sword and the musket. The final act in the long, slow dissolution of Mali came not from a distant, foreign power, but from a people who had long lived within its shadow. A new force rising from the south, the Bamana people, centered around the growing city state of Segu had been steadily consolidating their power, absorbing smaller clans, and developing a potent military culture of their own. They were a hardy, agricultural people, and their rise was fueled by a profound sense of their own identity, distinct from the old Mandinka aristocracy. Throughout the 17th century, the Bamana Empire of Segu applied relentless pressure on the southern and eastern borders of the dwindling Malian state. This was not a single, grand invasion, but a slow, grinding process of raids, skirmishes, and the gradual absorption of territory, like a tide relentlessly eating away at a sandy shore. The Mansas of Mali, particularly a ruler named Mama Magan, fought back valiantly, attempting to preserve the last vestiges of their ancestral kingdom. But the historical momentum was against them. Their resources were depleted, their allies were gone, and their claim to a divine right to rule rang hollow in the face of Bamana spears. The culmination of this struggle, according to the oral traditions that preserve this final chapter, came around the year 1670. In that year, the forces of the Bamana are said to have marched on the ancient capital of Niani itself. The city, which had witnessed the birth of the empire under Sundiata and the golden age of Mansa Musa, was sacked and burned. The mud, brick walls of the royal palaces, which had once been hung with rich tapestries and had echoed with the music of the kora and balafon, crumbled under the assault. The destruction of Niani was not just the end of a battle. It was the extinguishing of a symbolic flame, the final physical erasure of the Mali Empire from the map of West Africa. The last Mansa was forced to flee, and the very concept of a unified Malian state dissolved, its people and its legacy scattered among the ascendant powers of the region. And yet, an empire built not just of gold and stone but of story and memory can never be completely erased. As the physical kingdom crumbled and its palaces returned to the red earth from which they were built, the empire underwent a final, remarkable transformation. It ceased to be a political entity and became instead a cultural legacy, a vast and intricate tapestry of memory, preserved not in archives or monuments, but in the minds and voices of the griots. These hereditary bards, the living libraries of West Africa, had always been central to the Mandinka world, but now their role became paramount. They were the vessels that would carry the story of Mali across the centuries, ensuring that the names of Sundiata Keita and Mansa Musa would not be forgotten. In villages across the old heartland, as the sun would set and the cool evening air settled over the savannah, a traveler might still hear the timeless sound of a kora being plucked. They might see a griot, his eyes closed in concentration, begin the ancient epic, his voice a low, rhythmic chant that wove together genealogies, heroic deeds, and cautionary tales. The empire of Mali ceased to exist on the ground, but it lived on in the air, carried on the breath of storytellers. The gold had been spent. The cities had fallen. But the story of how a kingdom built on the shifting sands could, for a time, become the world's golden heart. That story proved to be the most enduring treasure of all. The desert and the passage of time had reclaimed the physical realm. But the spirit of Mali, transmuted into pure narrative, had found a way to endure. Rest well. We will meet again at dusk. And so, the great empire of Mali, once a name that evoked the very essence of gold across the known world, recedes from the sharp edges of history into the softer, more ambiguous realm of legend. The final destruction of its capital, Niani, was not so much an event as it was a quiet surrender. The last stones of a grand palace finally giving way to the patient embrace of the savannah. One can almost feel the fine, warm dust settling in the market squares, where merchants once haggled over salt and silk. The soft whisper of the harmattan wind, replacing the scholarly debates that once echoed through its colonnades. A final, definitive silence falling over a kingdom reclaimed by the earth itself. The story of Mali is so often distilled to the singular image of Mansa Musa, the king of gold, captured forever on the Catalan Atlas with his gleaming orb. A fixed point of wonder in the medieval European imagination. Yet this legendary pilgrimage, a river of wealth that briefly altered the economies of the Mediterranean, perhaps obscures a more profound and enduring treasure. Deep within the cool, quiet libraries of the Sankor, Madrasa in Timbuktu, a different kind of wealth was being curated, one measured not in bullion, but in knowledge, preserved in the faint, dry scent of ink on hundreds of thousands of manuscripts that chronicled everything from astronomy to jurisprudence. A testament to a civilization that valued wisdom as highly as it did gold. The foundations of this empire, laid so firmly by the epic hero Sundiata Keita after his victory at Karina, were ultimately built upon the ever-shifting trade routes of the Sahara, as mobile and as unpredictable as the dunes themselves. Power in the Sahel has always been a fluid concept, and the gradual ascent of the rival Songhai Empire was less a sudden cataclysm and more a slow, inexorable turning of the tide, the natural process of one great wave receding as another gathers strength. The cracks in the Malian state were not formed by a single shattering blow, but rather by the slow erosion of time, internal rivalries, and the inevitable drift of commerce toward new centers of gravity. What remains today is not an empire of borders and armies, but an empire of echoes, a persistent cultural resonance that can still be felt across the vast expanse of West Africa. The great cities of Djenne and Jau still stand. Their magnificent mud brick architecture holding the warmth of a sun that once shone on the courtiers of the world's wealthiest man. Their silent walls a testament to a time when this land was the golden heart of a continent. The story of Mali is now carried not by kings, but by the griots, the keepers of memory, and in the quiet rustle of ancient papers. A quiet, enduring whisper on the desert wind. Rest well. We will meet again at dusk.